boy, baby boy. Talking to the fishies? You and me, you and me.
I'm gonna kill Aquaman.
Self.
No, we're not.
He must be stopped.
Everything he holds dear.
You want blood?
Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom.
Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is a 2023 superhero action-adventure film directed by James Wan, with Jason Momoa returning as Arthur Curry, Aquaman alongside Patrick Wilson as Orm, Yahya Abdul-Mateen II as Black Manta, Amber Heard as Mera, Nicole Kidman as Atlanta, Dolph Lundgren as King Nerus, Randall Park as Dr. Stephen Shin, and Temuera Morrison as Thomas Curry. The film had a reported production budget of approximately $205 million according to the numbers, while other industry estimates have placed the budget around $215 million, making it one of the most expensive productions in the DC franchise. Its worldwide theatrical gross reached approximately $440.18 million, including $124.48 million from the domestic market and $315.70 million internationally, meaning the movie earned a little more than twice its reported production budget before considering marketing, distribution costs, and theater shares. The film was released internationally beginning December 20, 2023, with its North American theatrical release on December 22, 2023, and it runs for approximately 124 minutes. The movie also carries the distinction of being the final theatrical film released under the DC Extended Universe banner that had begun with Man of Steel in 2013, giving it an unusual position within superhero cinema because it is simultaneously a direct sequel to Aquaman and the closing chapter of an entire cinematic era. From the opening stages, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom makes it clear that Arthur Curry is no longer simply the reluctant hero who discovered his Atlantean heritage in the first film. He is now attempting to balance several responsibilities at once, including his role as King of Atlantis, his identity as a protector of the surface world, his relationship with Mera, and his responsibilities as a new father. That change gives the character a different dramatic problem from the first movie. Previously, Arthur's central struggle involved discovering where he belonged and deciding whether he could accept the responsibilities connected to Atlantis. In the sequel, he already has the throne and the identity, but now he has to deal with the consequences of having power. Being king is not simply about fighting enemies. It means managing a civilization, making political decisions, protecting a population, and trying to maintain peace while still remaining the kind of rebellious, humorous character that made Jason Momoa's version of Aquaman so distinctive. This creates an interesting contradiction at the heart of the film. Arthur is more powerful and more responsible than before, but emotionally he still behaves like someone who would rather solve problems by jumping into the middle of the action. His personality remains casual, sarcastic, energetic, and sometimes immature, and the movie deliberately uses that personality to create humor. The contrast between Arthur's informal attitude and the seriousness of his position is one of the film's main sources of comedy. He can be the ruler of Atlantis and still behave like the same irreverent hero who does not take royal ceremony particularly seriously. That makes him entertaining, but it also creates a genuine leadership problem because a king cannot always treat every crisis like an adventure. The film therefore uses Arthur's new responsibilities to show that becoming powerful does not automatically mean becoming mature. He has to learn how to balance instinct with responsibility. This becomes particularly important because the villain from the first movie, Black Manta, returns with a much more dangerous purpose. Yahya Abdul-Mateen too plays David Kane as a character driven by revenge, and his motivation is directly connected to the previous film because he still blames Aquaman for the death of his father. The official DC synopsis establishes that Black Manta has obtained the mythic Black Trident, which gives him access to an ancient and malevolent power and makes him a significantly more dangerous opponent than before. This escalation is important because sequels are often expected to make the villain bigger and more powerful, but the challenge is to avoid making the conflict feel artificial. In Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, the Black Trident provides a supernatural explanation for Black Manta's increased power while also connecting the villain to an older part of Atlantean mythology. That allows the sequel to expand the mythology instead of simply giving Black Manta a stronger suit. His obsession with revenge is also emotionally understandable even though his actions become increasingly destructive. He believes Aquaman is responsible for the loss of his father, and that belief has consumed his identity. The problem is that revenge does not remain personal. As his power grows, his target expands from Arthur to Arthur's family, Atlantis, and eventually the wider world. This is an important transformation because it demonstrates how personal hatred can become catastrophic when combined with power. Black Manta begins with a specific grievance but gradually turns that grievance into a justification for mass destruction. The film therefore gives its villain a simple but recognizable emotional engine: revenge. The simplicity can be criticized because the character does not receive the same level of psychological exploration as Arthur, but the motivation is easy to understand and keeps the conflict moving. Black Manta is not trying to rule Atlantis simply because he wants a throne. He wants Aquaman to suffer, and that desire becomes the source of his willingness to use dangerous forces. The Black Trident also creates a connection between Black Manta and an ancient evil that predates the current generation. This makes the story larger than the personal conflict established in the first movie. Arthur and Black Manta are no longer simply two men with a grudge. Their conflict becomes connected to the history of Atlantis and the consequences of releasing an ancient power. This is where the movie moves firmly into fantasy adventure. The world is filled with underwater civilizations, ancient technology, strange creatures, lost kingdoms, giant insects, dangerous plants, frozen environments, and supernatural forces. The visual ambition is enormous. James Wan approaches the movie as a large-scale fantasy adventure rather than a grounded superhero drama, and that choice is consistent with the identity established by the first Aquaman. The underwater world remains colorful, exaggerated, and imaginative. Atlantis is not presented as a realistic underwater society but as a comic book fantasy civilization filled with elaborate architecture, strange vehicles, unusual creatures, glowing technology, and massive environments. This visual excess can be both a strength and a weakness. When the imagery works, the movie feels like a giant comic book brought to life. When the visual effects look artificial or overly digital, the same extravagance can become distracting. This is one of the central technical issues surrounding the film. Critics have disagreed significantly about the quality of the visual effects. Some reviews praised the scale, creature design, and action spectacle, while others criticized the CGI as garish or inconsistent. That difference in response is understandable because the movie intentionally pushes visual fantasy to an extreme level. It does not attempt to make Atlantis look like a realistic underwater civilization. Instead, it embraces a heightened comic book aesthetic. The success of that approach depends heavily on whether the viewer enjoys that style. For audiences who appreciate colorful fantasy spectacle, the movie offers a huge amount to look at. For viewers who prefer visual realism or restrained effects, the same scenes can feel artificial. James Wan's direction is strongest when the action has clear geography and momentum. Even critics who disliked aspects of the script often acknowledged that Wan can stage action effectively. His experience with horror and large-scale action allows him to build sequences around suspense, movement, and physical danger. The movie contains several large action sequences that involve underwater battles, land-based fights, vehicles, creatures, explosions, and environmental hazards. The variety helps prevent the action from becoming completely repetitive. Instead of placing every fight in the same underwater environment, the movie moves between different locations and types of threats. This gives the adventure a traveling quality. Arthur and Orm are sent through environments that feel different from Atlantis, and the contrast helps the movie maintain visual variety. One of the most entertaining elements is the relationship between Arthur and Orm. Patrick Wilson returns as Orm Marius, the former ocean master and Arthur's half-brother. In the first movie, Orm was Arthur's antagonist, and their conflict was rooted in their different views of Atlantis and the surface world. In the sequel, circumstances force Arthur to rely on the very brother he previously defeated. This creates the central relationship of the movie and is arguably its strongest source of character-driven entertainment. Arthur and Orm are opposites in personality. Arthur is casual, sarcastic, physically expressive, and comfortable making jokes. Orm is serious, formal, disciplined, and far less capable of understanding Arthur's humor. Their differences create a natural buddy comedy structure. Arthur constantly irritates Orm, while Orm's seriousness makes Arthur's jokes even funnier. This dynamic gives the movie energy during scenes that might otherwise be dominated by exposition. Patrick Wilson's performance benefits from the contrast because Orm becomes funny precisely because he refuses to behave like a conventional comedy character. He treats situations with extreme seriousness while Arthur behaves as though everything is an opportunity for another joke. Their relationship also contains genuine emotional development. Arthur does not simply need Orm because Orm is physically powerful. He needs to understand his brother as a person. Orm has lost his position, his power, and his certainty about his role. He is forced to confront a new identity in which he is no longer the king. Arthur, meanwhile, must decide whether he can trust someone who previously tried to defeat him. This creates an interesting reversal from the first film. The brothers once represented opposing visions of Atlantis. Now they have to cooperate to protect it. Their alliance demonstrates that family relationships can change when circumstances change. It also gives Orm an opportunity for redemption. Instead of being defined permanently by his previous actions, he can demonstrate that he is capable of making different choices. This does not erase his history, but it allows the character to evolve. The movie's strongest emotional scenes often emerge from this relationship because the brothers have genuine differences that create conflict without requiring them to become enemies. Their interactions are lighter than the darker elements of the plot, and that contrast helps the movie maintain its adventurous tone. Arthur's humor also keeps the film from becoming too heavy. Jason Momoa clearly understands the version of Aquaman he is playing. The character is physically imposing but emotionally relaxed, and Momoa uses that contradiction to create charm. Arthur can be surrounded by enormous danger and still make a joke, which can sometimes weaken dramatic tension but also gives the movie its identity. Without that humor, Aquaman could become a generic superhero king surrounded by CGI armies. With it, he remains distinctive. The challenge is that the film sometimes pushes the comedy too far, particularly when serious situations are interrupted by jokes or exaggerated dialogue. The balance between humor and drama is therefore inconsistent. Some jokes work because they emerge naturally from character relationships. Others feel inserted simply to keep the tone light. The Arthur-Orm dynamic is generally the strongest example of successful humor because the jokes come from personality rather than from random one-liners. The movie's family dimension is also more prominent than in the first film. Arthur is now a father, and that changes the emotional stakes. His child becomes a direct vulnerability because Black Manta is not merely trying to defeat Arthur in combat. He wants to hurt the people Arthur loves. This gives Arthur a reason to become more serious. Being a father introduces a responsibility that cannot be treated as another adventure. He can risk his own life, but protecting his family requires him to think differently. This theme connects with his responsibilities as king. Arthur has moved from being someone who primarily thinks about himself to someone responsible for an entire family and an entire kingdom. The movie therefore gives him multiple roles that compete for his attention. He is a husband, father, king, brother, and superhero. Each identity demands something different. The difficulty is that the movie does not spend enough time exploring all of these dimensions in depth. The runtime is 124 minutes, and there are many plot elements competing for space. The film has to introduce Black Manta's plan, explain the Black Trident, develop Orm's redemption, establish Arthur's family life, explore the environmental crisis, revisit Atlantis, introduce the Lost Kingdom, and deliver multiple action sequences. That is a lot of material. The result is a story that moves quickly and rarely becomes boring, but it can also feel crowded. Several supporting characters do not receive as much development as they could have received. Mera, for example, is an important character in the story and has significant action moments, but the emotional focus remains heavily concentrated on Arthur and Orm. Amber Heard's Mera is presented as a capable warrior and mother, but the film's narrative structure gives her less centrality than the title character and his brother. Nicole Kidman's Atlanta and Temuera Morrison's Thomas Curry return as Arthur's parents, while Dolph Lundgren again plays King Nerus. These characters contribute to the world building and family structure, but their roles are more limited. Randall Park's Drive Stephen Shin continues to connect the surface world to Atlantis, and his scientific curiosity provides an additional perspective on the underwater world. The supporting cast is large, but the screenplay has to move quickly between characters. This can make some of them feel like they are serving the plot rather than driving it. The strongest supporting relationship is clearly the one between Arthur and Orm because the movie builds an entire adventure around their partnership. Their scenes have a rhythm that other relationships do not always receive. The movie's environmental theme is another important component. Black Manta's plan is connected to an ancient Atlantean resource and to the effects of climate change. The story uses the fictional technology and mythology of Atlantis to dramatize a real-world environmental concern. This gives the film a contemporary theme beneath its fantasy surface. Arthur's role as king also means he is forced to think about the relationship between Atlantis and the surface world. In the first movie, the conflict between land and sea was a major political issue. In the sequel, the environmental crisis provides a reason for those worlds to confront their shared vulnerability. The ocean is not isolated from the surface. Pollution, climate change, and rising temperatures affect both. This makes the film's environmental message relevant to the larger mythology. The weakness is that the message is often delivered in a very direct way. Some critics felt that the movie's climate commentary was too obvious or clumsy. Instead of allowing the theme to emerge naturally through the story, the screenplay sometimes has characters explain the issue directly. That can make the environmental message feel like an inserted lesson rather than an organic part of the fantasy. However, the underlying idea is appropriate for Aquaman because the character is inherently connected to the ocean. Environmental protection is not an unrelated theme for him. The ocean is his kingdom, his heritage, and the foundation of his identity. A story about the destruction or exploitation of the marine environment therefore makes sense within the character's world. The challenge is simply in how elegantly the theme is communicated. The movie's Lost Kingdom mythology is designed to expand the universe and create a new source of danger. The Black Trident's connection to an ancient power introduces a darker side of Atlantis that was only hinted at previously. This allows the movie to move beyond the political conflicts of the first installment and explore ancient history. The idea of a lost kingdom also creates mystery because the audience is encouraged to wonder what happened to this civilization and why its power was hidden. This is classic fantasy storytelling. Lost civilizations, forbidden technology, ancient weapons, and forgotten powers create a sense that the current characters are only seeing part of a much larger history. The film uses this mythology primarily to support action and atmosphere rather than conducting a deep historical investigation. That is appropriate for the movie's tone. It wants to move quickly from one spectacle to another. The ancient kingdom is therefore less a fully developed civilization than a narrative device that gives Black Manta access to a dangerous weapon and gives Arthur and Orm a destination for their adventure. This is one of the places where the movie can feel more like a comic book quest than a carefully structured political fantasy. The adventure structure is straightforward. A powerful villain obtains an ancient weapon, the heroes discover the threat, the heroes need an unlikely ally, the group travels to dangerous locations, secrets about the ancient power are revealed, and the final confrontation brings the major characters together. There is comfort in this formula because it is easy to follow. The audience rarely has to wonder what the basic objective is. Stop Black Manta, protect Atlantis, protect Arthur's family, and prevent global destruction. The simplicity also allows the movie to focus on spectacle. The weakness is that the plot can feel familiar. Superhero audiences have seen countless stories involving ancient weapons, magical artifacts, world-ending threats, reluctant alliances, and villains seeking revenge. What makes the film distinctive is not the originality of every plot element but the combination of Aquaman's underwater fantasy world, James Wan's visual style, Jason Momoa's performance, and the Arthur-Orm relationship. The movie's best scenes take advantage of those unique elements. When Arthur and Orm are interacting, the film feels specific to these characters. When the underwater world becomes visually extravagant, it feels specific to Aquaman. When the action uses the ocean environment creatively, the movie distinguishes itself from land-based superhero films. The underwater setting remains the franchise's biggest advantage. Aquaman exists in a world that most superhero movies cannot easily replicate. Atlantis allows filmmakers to combine fantasy, science fiction, mythology, and adventure. The ocean provides enormous visual space, and the film uses that space for giant creatures, submarines, underwater cities, weapons, and armies. The sense of scale can be impressive. Characters can move vertically and horizontally through the frame, creating action possibilities that differ from conventional land battles. Swimming itself becomes a form of movement that can be choreographed like flying. Arthur's ability to communicate with marine life also expands the range of creatures available for action and humor. The movie continues to embrace the strange side of its source material rather than trying to make Aquaman look serious in a traditional superhero way. This is important because the character was historically treated as a joke in popular culture. Jason Momoa's version succeeded partly because it accepted the absurdity of Aquaman and turned it into confidence. The sequel continues that approach. The film is not embarrassed by talking sea creatures, giant seahorses, strange underwater civilizations, or colorful armor. It treats them as normal within its world. That commitment to its own absurdity is one reason the movie can remain entertaining even when the plot becomes predictable. The audience is not watching for realism. It is watching for spectacle, adventure, humor, and character chemistry. The action choreography reflects that philosophy. The fights are large, energetic, and often designed around visual spectacle rather than realistic physical combat. Arthur is an extremely powerful character, so ordinary hand-to-hand fights cannot create much suspense unless the opponent possesses comparable power or the situation introduces another complication. Black Manta provides that complication through the Black Trident and advanced technology. Orm provides another through his own Atlantean abilities. The resulting battles can therefore become visually impressive. The film also uses environmental hazards such as ice, fire, creatures, and unusual terrain to create variety. This helps the movie avoid relying solely on superhero versus supervillain punches. The heroes are constantly moving through different environments, and each location offers a different kind of obstacle. James Wan's background in horror can sometimes be felt in the way the movie uses darkness and threatening environments. The Lost Kingdom has a more sinister atmosphere than the colorful Atlantis sequences. Ancient creatures and shadowy locations give the movie moments of genuine menace. These darker elements help balance the lighter comedy. The film does not become a horror movie, but it occasionally borrows horror imagery to make the ancient threat feel dangerous. This is one of Wan's strengths as a director. He understands how to create atmosphere even within a huge effects-driven production. However, the film's visual overload can sometimes work against atmosphere. When almost every frame contains glowing colors, creatures, machines, explosions, or elaborate digital environments, the audience can become visually saturated. Spectacle becomes less impressive when there is no contrast. A large action sequence can feel larger if it follows a quieter scene. A strange creature can feel stranger if the surrounding environment is relatively simple. A dangerous villain can feel more threatening if the movie allows moments of silence. Aquaman in the Lost Kingdom frequently moves at a fast pace, which keeps energy high but reduces opportunities for visual restraint. This is one reason some critics described the film as noisy or overstuffed. The movie is rarely empty, but not every visual element has equal impact. The strongest images are those connected to story or character. Arthur and Orm traveling together, Black Manta wielding the Black Trident, Atlantis under threat, and the heroes confronting ancient forces are memorable because they have narrative meaning. Random CGI creatures are entertaining but less emotionally important. The movie's use of comedy also works best when it emerges from character. Arthur's relationship with Orm is the clearest example. Their contrasting personalities create jokes without requiring the screenplay to interrupt the story. Orm's inability to understand Arthur's casual behavior becomes funny because we know their history. Arthur's willingness to tease his former enemy becomes funny because it demonstrates how differently he approaches conflict. The humor also helps humanize Orm. In the first film, Orm was largely defined by his role as a political and military antagonist. In the sequel, seeing him struggle with Arthur's personality allows the audience to understand him as a person rather than simply a villain. His seriousness becomes a character trait rather than only a dramatic quality. This makes his eventual partnership more believable. He does not suddenly become Arthur's best friend. He remains uncomfortable with Arthur's methods, but he gradually recognizes that cooperation is necessary. The relationship is therefore built around reluctant respect. Arthur also learns something from Orm. Although Arthur is more casual and flexible, Orm understands leadership, discipline, and Atlantean politics in ways Arthur does not. The brothers complement one another. Arthur's instinct and creativity combine with Orm's discipline and knowledge. Their partnership demonstrates that different leadership styles can work together. This is one of the more effective themes in the film because it reflects Arthur's larger challenge as king. He cannot do everything alone. He needs people who possess strengths he lacks. Orm becomes the clearest example of that principle. The former enemy becomes an ally because Arthur learns that the qualities that once made Orm a threat can also make him valuable. Orm's knowledge of Atlantis and his fighting abilities are assets when directed toward a common goal. This is a classic redemption idea, but the sibling relationship gives it more emotional weight. Arthur does not simply recruit a powerful ally. He reconnects with his brother. Their relationship therefore becomes a story about forgiveness, trust, and family. The film does not explore these ideas with great psychological complexity, but the emotional structure is clear. The brothers begin separated by resentment and history, and they gradually become a team. This is the heart of the sequel. The first movie was about Arthur becoming Aquaman. The second is largely about Arthur learning that being Aquaman does not mean doing everything himself. He needs a family, allies, and a kingdom. He needs to accept that leadership is relational. A king is not powerful because he can defeat everyone alone. A king is powerful because people are willing to stand with him. That idea also connects with Mera and Arthur's child. His family is not a weakness that he must hide. It is a source of motivation. Black Manta's threat makes this explicit. The villain understands that Arthur's family is the place where he is most vulnerable, and Arthur's response shows that his priorities have changed. In the first movie, his conflict was personal and political. In the sequel, it is deeply familial. This gives the action more emotional urgency. Arthur is not fighting only for Atlantis as an abstract kingdom. He is fighting for people he loves. That makes the final conflict more personal even when the stakes become global. The movie's final act structure brings together the personal and the cosmic. Black Manta's revenge, the ancient evil, Atlantis' survival, Arthur's family, and the relationship between Arthur and Orm all converge. This is typical of modern superhero finales, where multiple plot threads must reach a single large confrontation. The risk is that the scale becomes so large that individual emotion can disappear. Aquaman in the Lost Kingdom tries to avoid that by keeping Arthur and Orm at the center. Their relationship provides a human-scale story inside the global conflict. The final battle therefore matters because it tests whether the brothers can work together and whether Arthur can protect both his family and his kingdom. The film's broader legacy is also significant because it closes the DCEU era. The DCEU had experienced major successes and major failures, and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom arrived at a time when the franchise was already being replaced by a new DC cinematic direction. That context inevitably affects how the movie is perceived, but it is important to separate the film itself from the larger franchise politics. The movie does not depend heavily on complicated crossover material. Instead, it functions primarily as a direct continuation of the first Aquaman. This is one of its strengths. Viewers do not need to understand every other DCEU film to follow the central story. The movie focuses on Arthur, Atlantis, Black Manta, Orm, and the family conflict. That makes it relatively self-contained. The fact that it was the final DCEU film gives the ending symbolic importance, but the story itself is not built around saying goodbye to every character from the larger universe. This allows the movie to remain an Aquaman story rather than becoming a franchise recap. Its relationship to the wider DCEU is therefore more historical than narrative. It closes an era without requiring every character to appear. That decision is sensible because the film already contains a lot of material. Adding more franchise references would have made the story even more crowded. The movie's reception reflected the difficulty of its position. Some critics enjoyed the spectacle, humor, and Momoa-Wilson chemistry, while others found the screenplay generic, the visual effects inconsistent, and the story overstuffed. These disagreements reveal the film's central identity. It is a movie that prioritizes entertainment and spectacle over deep dramatic complexity. Viewers expecting a sophisticated superhero drama may find it disappointing. Viewers looking for colorful fantasy adventure may have a better experience. The film's strengths are not subtle. It wants to be fun. It wants to be loud. It wants to show strange creatures, enormous battles, underwater cities, ancient weapons, and two brothers who cannot stop arguing. That is the movie's personality. The question is whether that personality is enough to sustain 124 minutes. For many viewers, the answer depends on how much they enjoy the characters. Arthur remains charismatic because Jason Momoa brings a relaxed energy to the role, while Patrick Wilson gives Orm a more restrained comic presence. Their chemistry creates a rhythm that keeps the movie moving even when the plot becomes familiar. The visual spectacle then provides the large-scale entertainment expected from a film of this budget. With a reported production budget of around $205 million and worldwide box office earnings of about $440.18 million, the movie was commercially significant but far below the extraordinary level reached by the first Aquaman, which had earned more than $1.14 billion worldwide. That comparison is important because expectations were naturally higher after the original film's enormous success. The sequel could not simply be judged as an ordinary superhero movie, it was also being compared with one of the biggest DC hits ever. The financial decline therefore contributed to the perception that the film represented the end of an era rather than the beginning of another major Aquaman franchise. Nevertheless, the sequel's worldwide gross demonstrates that the character still had substantial international appeal. The movie performed particularly strongly in international markets relative to its domestic gross, with approximately $315.7 million internationally compared with $124.48 million domestically. This international performance is consistent with the global popularity of the superhero genre and the visual accessibility of an action-adventure story that depends heavily on spectacle rather than culturally specific dialogue. The film's underwater fantasy setting also gives it a distinctive visual identity that can travel across markets. The financial outcome, however, should not be confused with critical quality. A movie can earn hundreds of millions and still receive mixed reviews, particularly when its production costs are extremely high. The reported budget of $205 million means the theatrical gross of $440 million does not automatically represent $235 million of profit because theaters retain part of ticket revenue and marketing, distribution, and other costs are separate from the production budget. The financial numbers therefore demonstrate commercial reach rather than simple net profit. From a production perspective, the film is clearly an enormous technical undertaking. The official DC production information credits James Wan as director, Peter Safran, James Wan, and Rob Cowan as producers, David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick as screenwriter, and a large behind-the-scenes team responsible for cinematography, production design, editing, visual effects, costumes, and music. That scale is visible on screen. Atlantis, the Lost Kingdom, underwater vehicles, giant creatures, ancient weapons, and massive battle sequences require extensive visual effects and production design. The movie is therefore best understood as a large-scale fantasy adventure rather than a character drama that happens to include superheroes. Its visual ambition is central to its identity. The challenge is that visual ambition also creates high expectations. When a movie spends hundreds of millions of dollars, viewers naturally expect the effects to look consistently convincing. The mixed critical reaction to the CGI shows how difficult that standard is to meet. Some sequences look impressive because the design is imaginative and the action is clearly staged, while other digital environments can appear artificial. The issue is not necessarily that the movie lacks visual creativity. It has plenty. The issue is consistency. The audience needs to believe in the physical world long enough to become emotionally invested. If a creature or environment looks obviously artificial, the viewer can become aware of the technology instead of remaining inside the story. This is especially challenging for a movie in which almost everything is digital. The filmmakers are not simply adding a few creatures to real environments. They are creating entire worlds. That makes visual consistency extremely difficult. James Wan compensates partly through movement and action. When characters are constantly moving through an environment, the audience has less time to inspect individual details. Dynamic editing can maintain the illusion. The danger is that too much movement can also create visual fatigue. The movie therefore walks a narrow line between spectacle and overload. When the balance works, the result is exhilarating. When it fails, the audience may feel that there is too much happening at once. The story's emotional core helps provide structure within that spectacle. Arthur and Orm give the audience characters to follow through the chaos. Their relationship acts as a guide. Even when the locations become strange, the audience understands what the brothers want. Arthur wants to protect his family and kingdom. Orm wants to regain a sense of purpose and prove that he can contribute after losing his throne. Black Manta wants revenge. These motivations are simple but clear. Clarity is valuable in a movie with a complicated visual world. The audience does not need to understand every piece of Atlantean technology if it understands why the characters are fighting. The movie's best sequences therefore combine spectacle with character motivation. A fight is more interesting when the viewer understands what the character is protecting. A journey is more interesting when the relationship between the travelers is changing. A villain's attack is more threatening when it targets something emotionally important. The film's greatest success is its ability to keep Arthur and Orm's relationship central despite the huge scale. Their partnership provides the movie with personality. Without it, the sequel could have become a generic collection of CGI battles. With it, the film has a recognizable emotional rhythm. Arthur's relaxed confidence clashes with Orm's rigid seriousness. Arthur wants to improvise. Orm wants structure. Arthur jokes. Orm rarely understands the joke. Arthur sees his brother as family. Orm has to overcome the history of being defeated and imprisoned. Their relationship therefore carries both comedy and emotional development. It also allows the movie to revisit the first film without simply repeating it. The brothers are still connected to the same history, but their roles have changed. Arthur is now king. Orm is now the former king and prisoner. Their positions have reversed. That reversal creates opportunities for both humor and character development. Arthur has to learn how to treat Orm as an ally rather than an enemy, while Orm has to learn how to accept help from the brother he once considered inferior. Their journey is therefore a story of changed perspectives. The sequel's larger message can be understood through this relationship. People are not permanently defined by the role they occupied in the past. An enemy can become an ally. A defeated king can become a valuable protector. A reckless hero can become a responsible father. A divided family can become a team. These transformations are simple, but they fit the optimistic tone of the film. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is not trying to deliver a dark psychological portrait. It is trying to show that relationships can change when people are willing to put aside old conflicts for a larger purpose. The threat of Black Manta creates that opportunity. His revenge forces Arthur and Orm to cooperate. The crisis becomes the reason they discover a new relationship. This is a familiar storytelling structure, but it works because the personalities involved are entertaining. The film's action-adventure identity also benefits from the fact that Arthur and Orm have different physical styles. Arthur is powerful and improvisational, while Orm is trained and disciplined. Their fights can therefore feel different even when they are facing the same enemies. Their teamwork becomes visually interesting because their abilities complement one another. The movie repeatedly emphasizes that their combined strengths are greater than their individual abilities. This is both an action principle and a family theme. Arthur needs Orm. Orm needs Arthur. The brothers are stronger when they stop competing and start cooperating. That idea gives the movie emotional cohesion. The Lost Kingdom itself can also be viewed as a metaphor for forgotten history. Atlantis is already a civilization with ancient divisions and hidden secrets, but the existence of another lost kingdom suggests that the current political structure is only one part of a much older story. The characters are dealing with consequences created long before they were born. This gives the mythology a sense of depth even when the screenplay does not explore every historical detail. The Black Trident becomes a physical object representing that buried history. It contains power that should not be released, and Black Manta's obsession with revenge allows that power to return. The story therefore connects personal anger with ancient danger. Black Manta believes he can control the weapon because he believes his revenge gives him purpose. Instead, the weapon's power threatens to consume the world. This creates a warning about the destructive nature of obsession. Revenge can begin as a desire for justice but becomes something much darker when the person pursuing it stops caring about consequences. Black Manta's tragedy is that his original grief is understandable, but his response transforms him into a greater threat than the person he blames. Arthur's response is the opposite. He experiences loss and responsibility but chooses protection rather than revenge. The two characters therefore represent different responses to pain. Black Manta allows grief to become hatred. Arthur allows responsibility to become purpose. The movie does not explore this contrast with extreme subtlety, but it is clearly present. That contrast also explains why the final conflict is emotionally appropriate. Arthur is fighting someone who has allowed revenge to define his life. He is trying to protect the future, while Black Manta remains trapped in the past. The Lost Kingdom and Ancient Weapon reinforce that theme because the villain literally reaches into ancient history to empower his present anger. Arthur, meanwhile, has to think about his family and kingdom in the present. One character is consumed by the past, the other is forced to build a future. Orm occupies a middle position because he is also haunted by his past as king and antagonist. His journey involves learning that his past does not have to determine his future. That makes the brothers' alliance even more meaningful. Arthur and Orm are both characters who have to move beyond old identities. Arthur is no longer simply the outsider. Orm is no longer simply the enemy. The world around them has changed, and they must change with it. This is perhaps the most important character theme in the movie. Identity is not fixed. People can inherit roles, lose roles, and choose new roles. Arthur inherited the responsibility of Atlantis but had to choose whether to accept it. Orm inherited a position of power but had to learn how to live without it. Black Manta inherited grief and chose revenge. Mera becomes both queen and mother. These different identities create a story about responsibility and choice. The movie may not analyze these ideas deeply, but they provide a coherent foundation beneath the action. Arthur's final role is therefore not simply Aquaman the superhero. He is a leader who has learned that family and kingdom cannot be separated from his identity. His personal life and public responsibilities are connected. That connection makes him more mature than the Arthur we met in the first film, even though his personality remains largely unchanged. The growth is therefore situational rather than transformational. He is still Jason Momoa's charismatic, humorous Aquaman, but the circumstances around him require more responsibility. This is a sensible approach because changing his personality completely would make the sequel feel disconnected. Instead, the movie asks what happens when the same personality has to handle greater responsibilities. The answer is that Arthur sometimes struggles. He makes mistakes. He relies on others. He learns to work with Orm. He becomes more protective of his family. These are believable extensions of the first film's character rather than a total reinvention. That continuity is one of the movie's strengths. It respects the tone that audiences liked in the original while expanding the stakes. The sequel is therefore best understood as an escalation of the first film rather than a reinvention of it. It gives Arthur a larger kingdom, a larger family, a more dangerous enemy, a more complicated brother relationship, and a more expansive mythology. The risk is that bigger does not always mean better. The first Aquaman surprised audiences partly because its absurdity felt fresh. The sequel has to repeat some of those ingredients while trying to make them feel new. Sometimes it succeeds through the Arthur-Orm relationship and the expanded fantasy environments. Sometimes it feels like a familiar superhero formula. This tension explains much of the critical divide. The movie is undeniably ambitious and technically massive, but ambition does not guarantee emotional depth. Its greatest strength is entertainment value. Its greatest weakness is that the screenplay sometimes struggles to give that entertainment enough narrative sophistication. Yet the film remains coherent enough to function as a satisfying continuation for viewers who enjoyed the first movie. The action is frequent, the visual world is imaginative, the central performances are committed, and the story has a clear emotional center in the brothers. It does not need to be the most profound superhero movie to work as an adventure. Its purpose is closer to a colorful comic book journey than a serious political drama. The movie understands that identity and embraces it. That may be why some critics found it enjoyable despite its flaws. The film is not trying to convince the audience that Aquaman is realistic. It is trying to convince the audience that this bizarre underwater world is worth exploring. For viewers willing to accept that premise, there is plenty of entertainment. The Lost Kingdom, ancient weapon, giant creatures, underwater battles, surface world conflicts, and sibling comedy all contribute to a large fantasy package. The movie's 124-minute runtime gives enough space for those elements without becoming an extremely long superhero epic, although the density of the plot can make the pacing feel busy. The story rarely stops completely, which keeps momentum high. The downside is that emotional scenes sometimes have to compete with the next action sequence. A quieter moment may begin to develop and then quickly give way to another plot requirement. This is particularly noticeable with supporting characters who could benefit from more time. The film's central pair receives the most attention because their relationship is essential to the story, while other characters often function more as parts of the larger world. That is a reasonable trade-off in an action-adventure, but it limits the emotional complexity. The audience understands Arthur and Orm better than many of the surrounding characters. The movie's greatest emotional achievement is therefore the transformation of their relationship. They begin from conflict and end from cooperation, and that movement mirrors the larger theme of overcoming old divisions. The first film established Arthur as a bridge between worlds. The sequel expands that idea by making him a bridge between people. He connects Atlantis and the surface world, but he also connects his family members, his former enemy, and different political interests. This is the natural evolution of the character. Arthur's greatest power is not only his ability to control marine life or fight underwater. It is his ability to connect worlds that do not naturally trust each other. His mixed heritage gives him a unique position. He understands the surface world because he was raised there, and he understands Atlantis because he is its king. This dual identity allows him to see conflicts from more than one perspective. The movie uses that identity to support its environmental message as well. The ocean and the surface world are connected, just as Arthur is connected to both. Damage to one affects the other. This is a logical extension of the character's mythology. The film's message about cooperation therefore operates on multiple levels. Brothers must cooperate, kingdoms must cooperate, and humanity must recognize its relationship with the ocean. The problem is that the screenplay sometimes states these ideas too directly instead of allowing them to emerge naturally. Still, the thematic foundation is sound. The movie ultimately argues that survival requires cooperation across divisions. Arthur and Orm represent family division. Atlantis and the surface represent political division. Human beings and the ocean represent environmental division. Black Manta represents the destructive consequences of refusing to move beyond personal hatred. These ideas connect the major elements of the story. The film is therefore more coherent thematically than its busy plot might initially suggest. It repeatedly returns to the question of whether people can put aside personal interests for a larger responsibility. Arthur must put aside his distrust of Orm. Orm must put aside his resentment toward Arthur. Atlantis must recognize its relationship with the surface. Arthur must balance his personal desires with his responsibilities as king and father. The heroes must cooperate against Black Manta. These choices create the emotional structure of the adventure. The villain represents the opposite philosophy. Black Manta refuses to let go of the past. He defines himself through revenge and therefore becomes willing to destroy everything around him. The Black Trident amplifies that obsession. It gives him power but also connects him to a destructive ancient force. The message is clear. Power without emotional control can become catastrophic. Arthur's strength, by contrast, becomes meaningful when he uses it to protect rather than dominate. Orm's strength becomes meaningful when he uses it in service of his brother and kingdom rather than for his own throne. This gives the superhero spectacle a moral framework. The characters are powerful, but the important question is what they do with that power. The final battle therefore becomes more than a test of physical strength. It becomes a test of whether Arthur and Orm can work together and whether Black Manta's hatred can be stopped before it destroys the world. The film's conclusion brings the story to a logical endpoint by resolving the immediate threat while also allowing Arthur's role as king to continue beyond the movie. The larger DCEU may be ending, but Arthur's personal journey reaches a point of greater stability. He has family, a kingdom, a brother who has changed, and a clearer understanding of his responsibilities. That gives the character a sense of completion even though the franchise itself was being replaced. In that sense, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom functions well as a final chapter for this version of the character. It does not attempt to summarize the entire DCEU. Instead, it closes Arthur Curry's particular story by emphasizing family, leadership, responsibility, and the future. The movie's legacy will likely remain tied to its position as the final DCEU film and to the enormous success of the first Aquaman, but it should also be evaluated on its own terms. It is an expensive, colorful, effects-heavy fantasy adventure with a straightforward story, strong central chemistry, inconsistent visual effects, frequent humor, and a clear emphasis on entertainment. Its biggest asset is the partnership between Jason Momoa and Patrick Wilson. Its biggest narrative strength is the transformation of Arthur and Orm from enemies into allies. Its biggest visual strength is the imaginative underwater world. Its biggest thematic strength is the idea that responsibility requires cooperation and that people should not remain trapped by the identities and conflicts of their past. Its biggest weakness is that the screenplay tries to carry too many elements at once, which can make the supporting characters and some emotional ideas feel underdeveloped. Nevertheless, the film delivers the essential ingredients of the Aquaman experience: enormous underwater fantasy, strange creatures, superhero action, colorful environments, family drama, comedy, and James Wan's energetic direction. It is not a movie built around subtle realism or intricate psychological storytelling. It is a comic book adventure that wants to be visually excessive and emotionally accessible. When judged within that framework, its most successful moments are the ones where the spectacle is connected to character. Arthur fighting to protect his family matters because we understand what that family means to him. Orm fighting beside Arthur matters because we understand where their relationship began. Black Manta's power matters because we understand that his revenge has consumed him. Atlantis matters because Arthur has accepted responsibility for it. The ocean matters because it connects Arthur's identity to both worlds. These connections give meaning to the spectacle. Without them, the movie would be only a collection of expensive effects. With them, it becomes a recognizable final adventure for Jason Momoa's Aquaman. The film's ultimate appeal therefore comes from its willingness to embrace the strange, colorful, and sometimes ridiculous nature of its world while still giving its central characters a simple emotional journey. Arthur must protect his family and kingdom. Orm must find a new purpose. Black Manta must be stopped before revenge destroys everything. The brothers must learn to trust each other. Atlantis and the surface world must recognize their shared future. These goals are straightforward, but their combination creates a fast-moving adventure that rarely loses sight of its central relationship. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom may not reach the originality or cultural impact of the first film, and its financial performance was far below the previous Aquaman's extraordinary worldwide total, but it remains a visually ambitious and character-driven continuation whose strongest moments come from the unlikely partnership between two brothers who once stood on opposite sides of a throne. In the end, the movie's most important idea is not about who deserves to rule Atlantis or who possesses the most powerful weapon. It is about what people choose to do with power when the people they love are threatened. Arthur chooses protection over revenge. Orm chooses cooperation over rivalry. Black Manta chooses revenge and destruction, and that choice ultimately defines him. The contrast between these paths gives the movie its emotional foundation. The Lost Kingdom is therefore best understood as a large-scale fantasy adventure about family, responsibility, redemption, and the consequences of refusing to let go of the past, wrapped inside the colorful spectacle of the Aquaman universe and delivered with the energetic style of James Wan. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom continues its story by placing Arthur Curry in a completely different position from the one he occupied in the first film. He is no longer the outsider trying to discover whether he belongs in Atlantis. He is now the king, a husband, a father, and the protector of a kingdom that is constantly exposed to threats from both inside and outside the ocean. DC's official material describes Arthur as balancing his duties as king of Atlantis with his new responsibilities as a father, while Black Manta returns with the Black Trident and an obsession with revenge, forcing Arthur to seek help from his imprisoned half-brother Orm. This change in Arthur's position is important because it gives the sequel a different emotional foundation. In the first movie, Arthur's biggest question was identity. He had to understand his connection to Atlantis, accept his heritage, and decide whether he was worthy of becoming king. In the sequel, that uncertainty has largely disappeared. The problem is no longer whether Arthur is Aquaman. The problem is whether Arthur can successfully carry the responsibilities that come with being Aquaman. Being king means making decisions that affect thousands or millions of people. Being a father means protecting someone who cannot protect himself. Being a husband means recognizing that his actions affect the person closest to him. Being a superhero means responding to threats that no ordinary political leader could handle. These responsibilities pull Arthur in different directions, and the movie uses that tension to create a more mature version of the character without completely changing his personality. Jason Momoa continues to play Arthur as a confident, humorous, physically powerful hero who does not always behave like a traditional king. He remains casual even when surrounded by royal ceremony, and that contrast creates much of the movie's comedy. Arthur can command armies, communicate with marine life, and fight enormous enemies, yet he can still behave like the same relaxed person who would rather make a joke than participate in formal politics. That personality is part of what made the character successful in the first place, and the sequel wisely keeps it intact. However, The movie also demonstrates that Arthur's casual nature can become a problem when serious leadership decisions are required. A king cannot simply react to every situation with instinct. He has to think about consequences. The sequel therefore creates a subtle conflict between Arthur's natural personality and the responsibilities of his position. He is powerful enough to solve many problems physically, but physical strength cannot solve political problems, family problems, or moral problems. This is where Orm becomes especially important. Patrick Wilson's Orm is one of the most effective elements of the entire movie because his relationship with Arthur creates both comedy and genuine character development. In the first movie, Orm was Arthur's enemy and the ruler who believed Atlantis needed to unite against the surface world. By the beginning of the sequel, Orm has lost his throne and is imprisoned. His position has completely changed. He is no longer the powerful king who can command armies. Instead, he becomes the reluctant ally Arthur needs. DC officially describes the brothers as being forced to set aside their differences in order to protect Atlantis, Arthur's family, and the world. This creates a classic enemies to allies structure, but the sibling relationship makes it more emotionally interesting. Arthur and Orm are not simply two heroes with different personalities. They are brothers who have already fought each other, and the history between them cannot disappear immediately. Arthur has to decide whether he can trust someone who previously tried to defeat him. Orm has to accept help from the brother he once considered an obstacle to his own rule. Their partnership is therefore based on necessity at first, but gradually develops into something more meaningful. The humor comes naturally from their differences. Arthur is relaxed and sarcastic, while Orm is serious, disciplined, and formal. Arthur can be surrounded by danger and still find a reason to joke, while Orm often treats every situation with extreme seriousness. Their conversations create a buddy adventure rhythm that gives the movie energy between the larger action scenes. This is important because the plot itself can become extremely dense. There are ancient weapons, underwater kingdoms, political problems, environmental threats, family drama, and large-scale battles. Without the Arthur-Orm relationship, the movie could easily become an endless sequence of exposition followed by CGI action. Their chemistry provides a human center. The audience can understand the adventure through their relationship because their personalities create a simple emotional structure. Arthur wants his brother to help him. Orm does not want to cooperate. Circumstances force them together, and eventually they begin to understand one another. The relationship also gives Orm a redemption arc. He is not suddenly transformed into a completely different person. Instead, he is given the opportunity to demonstrate that his abilities can serve a different purpose. In the first movie, Orm used his strength and political influence to challenge Arthur and the surface world. In the sequel, those same qualities can be used to protect Atlantis. This demonstrates that a person's abilities are not inherently good or evil. What matters is how those abilities are directed. Orm's knowledge of Atlantean history and politics, his combat ability, and his experience as a ruler make him valuable even though his previous actions caused serious conflict. Arthur therefore has to learn that leadership can mean recognizing the strengths of someone who once stood against you. That is a meaningful lesson for Arthur as king. A ruler cannot simply surround himself with people who agree with him. He needs people with different knowledge, different experiences, and different strengths. Orm becomes the clearest example of that principle. Their relationship also changes the way the audience sees Orm. In the first film, he was primarily defined by ambition. In the sequel, the audience gets to see him outside the throne. Without royal authority, Orm becomes more vulnerable. He is forced to confront what remains of his identity when he is no longer king. This is an interesting parallel with Arthur. Arthur is learning how to live with more responsibility, while Orm is learning how to live with less power. Both brothers are therefore being forced to reconsider who they are. Arthur has gained a kingdom but lost some freedom. Orm has lost a kingdom but gains an opportunity to discover a different purpose. Their circumstances are opposite, yet both are dealing with identity. This makes their alliance more meaningful than a simple action partnership. The movie also uses their relationship to explore the idea of family forgiveness. Arthur does not forget what Orm did, and Orm does not suddenly forget his resentment. But the existence of a larger threat creates an opportunity for them to move beyond their previous conflict. The film's message is not that past actions do not matter. Instead, it suggests that people can make different choices in the future. Orm can be held accountable for his past while still being allowed to prove that he can change. That is an important element of redemption. A character is not redeemed simply because another character says he is forgiven. Redemption requires action. Orm has to demonstrate his loyalty through what he does. His willingness to risk himself for Arthur and Atlantis becomes more meaningful because the audience remembers where their relationship began. The same principle applies to Arthur. He must learn to trust his brother despite his history. Trust becomes a decision rather than an assumption. This creates emotional tension inside the action. When Arthur and Orm fight side by side, the audience understands that the significance is not simply that two powerful characters are fighting together. The significance is that two brothers who once fought against each other have chosen to stand on the same side. This is one of the clearest examples of the movie using spectacle to express character development. The action is not separate from the emotional story. It demonstrates the emotional story. Black Manta, meanwhile, represents the opposite direction. He is a character who refuses to move beyond the past. His entire identity remains connected to his father's death and his desire for revenge against Arthur. DC's official synopsis emphasizes that Black Manta remains driven by the need to avenge his father's death and becomes more dangerous after obtaining the Black Trident. His motivation is straightforward, but it works because revenge is the exact opposite of the transformation Arthur and Orm are experiencing. Arthur and Orm are learning to move forward. Black Manta is trapped in what happened before. He cannot imagine a future that is not built around making Arthur suffer. This makes him a useful thematic opponent even when his character is not explored with enormous psychological detail. He represents what happens when grief becomes obsession. His original pain may be understandable, but his response becomes increasingly destructive. He stops caring about the boundaries between personal revenge and mass destruction. Once he possesses the Black Trident, his personal conflict becomes a global threat. The weapon gives him access to ancient power, but it also symbolizes how dangerous obsession can become when combined with enormous strength. Black Manta believes power will finally give him justice, but the more powerful he becomes, the less capable he is of seeing the difference between justice and revenge. This is important because the movie's central heroes are also dealing with power. Arthur is a king with enormous abilities. Orm was once a king. Black Manta gains supernatural power. The question is not who has power. The question is what each person does with it. Arthur uses power to protect. Orm learns to redirect his power toward cooperation. Black Manta uses power to destroy. The contrast is simple but effective. It gives the superhero spectacle a moral foundation. The Black Trident also expands the mythology beyond the political conflict of the first movie. The first Aquaman focused heavily on Atlantis, the surface world, and Arthur's right to the throne. The sequel introduces an older and darker layer of Atlantean history. The Lost Kingdom becomes a symbol of the dangers buried beneath the present world. The characters are dealing with consequences that began long before they were born. This gives the story a sense of ancient history and makes the underwater world feel larger. Atlantis is not the entire history of the ocean. There are civilizations, powers, and secrets that existed before the current political structure. The Lost Kingdom therefore provides the movie with a fantasy-adventure atmosphere that resembles ancient mythology. The Black Trident becomes the object connecting the past with the present. Black Manta's revenge gives him a reason to search for power, and that search releases something that should have remained hidden. The story therefore connects personal anger to ancient danger. This is a familiar fantasy structure, but it works well within the Aquaman universe because the franchise has always combined superhero storytelling with mythology. The ocean is not simply a setting. It is an entire world with its own history. That world allows the filmmakers to introduce civilizations and creatures that would look unusual in almost any other superhero movie. This is one of the franchise's strongest advantages. Aquaman can be strange without apology. The film does not attempt to make Atlantis look like a realistic underwater city. It embraces comic book exaggeration. There are enormous structures, glowing technology, unusual marine creatures, strange vehicles, powerful weapons, and elaborate costumes. This creates a visual identity that separates the movie from more grounded superhero franchises. The underwater environment also allows James Wan to create action sequences that do not behave like ordinary land-based battles. Characters can move vertically, swim at high speed, attack from different directions, and use the environment in unusual ways. Arthur's connection to marine life expands the range of creatures available to the story, while Atlantis provides the technological and political background. The result is a movie that constantly changes visual environments. One scene can take place in an advanced underwater city, another in a dangerous wilderness, another on the surface, and another inside an ancient lost civilization. This constant movement contributes to the sense of adventure. It also reflects the movie's title. The Lost Kingdom is not merely a location. It represents the discovery of a part of the ocean that the characters do not fully understand. Adventure stories often rely on this structure. The heroes begin with a problem, discover that the problem is larger than expected, travel into an unknown environment, learn more about the threat, and eventually return to confront it. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom follows that basic pattern. The difference is that the characters already live in an extraordinary world, so the new locations have to be even more extreme. This creates a constant escalation of spectacle. The challenge is that escalation can eventually become exhausting. When every location is enormous and every creature is strange, the audience may become less impressed because there is no visual baseline for comparison. Contrast is essential in visual storytelling. A huge environment feels bigger when it follows a simple one. A terrifying creature feels more threatening when the movie allows quiet moments. A major battle feels more important when the characters have had time to recover emotionally from the previous conflict. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom sometimes moves so quickly that the audience has little time to absorb the scale of what it is seeing. This is one reason the movie can feel crowded. There is always another location, another creature, another explanation, another fight, or another piece of mythology. The movie's 124-minute runtime is substantial, but the number of story elements competing for that time is also substantial. The result is a fast-moving experience that rarely becomes boring but sometimes lacks breathing room. The environmental theme adds another layer to this already busy narrative. The story connects Atlantis and the surface world through environmental consequences, suggesting that the health of the ocean is connected to the health of the planet. This is a logical theme for an Aquaman movie because Arthur's identity is inseparable from the sea. He is the bridge between the surface and the underwater world. DC describes Arthur as the son of a lighthouse keeper and an Atlantean queen and emphasizes his position as a bridge between the surface world and his underwater realm. 3. That dual identity makes environmental storytelling natural. Arthur is uniquely positioned to understand that the surface and ocean cannot be treated as completely separate worlds. Pollution, climate change, and exploitation affect both. The movie's environmental message therefore fits the mythology, even if some of its dialogue presents the theme more directly than necessary. The idea itself is strong because it reinforces Arthur's role as a bridge. He is not simply the king of one isolated civilization. He is someone who belongs to two connected worlds. This creates a responsibility that neither traditional Atlantean rulers nor ordinary surface politicians fully understand. Arthur can see the consequences of decisions from both sides. His leadership therefore requires cooperation rather than isolation. This is also reflected in the relationship between Atlantis and the surface. The first movie established that the underwater kingdoms and surface nations were divided by suspicion and fear. The sequel continues to explore the idea that these worlds need to cooperate. Arthur's personal identity mirrors the political problem. Just as Arthur contains both human and Atlantean heritage, the planet contains both ocean and land ecosystems. Separation is an illusion. The movie therefore uses its superhero mythology to communicate a simple environmental principle: what happens in one world can eventually affect the other. This theme also connects to Black Manta's plan because his actions threaten not only Atlantis but the wider world. A threat that begins beneath the ocean can become a threat everywhere. That makes the ocean central to the movie's global stakes. The film's action sequences are designed around that scale. Arthur is no longer fighting only for a throne. He is fighting to prevent destruction from spreading beyond Atlantis. The scale of the threat gives the movie an appropriately large superhero climax, but it also creates one of the screenplay's weaknesses. When the stakes become global, the emotional consequences can become abstract. Saying that the world is in danger is less emotionally powerful than showing what a specific character stands to lose. Fortunately, the movie keeps Arthur's family near the center of the conflict. Black Manta's threat to Arthur's family makes the danger personal. Arthur is not simply trying to save an abstract population. He is trying to protect his wife and child. This gives him a reason to fight beyond his responsibilities as king. His family represents the private side of his identity, while Atlantis represents the public side. The movie brings those two sides together by making both vulnerable to the same villain. This forces Arthur to stop thinking of his responsibilities as separate categories. He cannot be a father in one moment and a king in another. He has to be both at once. That is a more mature challenge than the one he faced in the first film. The first movie asked whether Arthur could accept his heritage. The sequel asks whether he can carry the weight of that heritage without losing the people closest to him. This is an important development. Power changes the nature of responsibility. When Arthur was simply an adventurer, he could take risks primarily for himself. As king and father, his decisions affect everyone around him. The movie uses this to create tension between Arthur's natural impulsiveness and his responsibilities. He still wants to rush into danger, but now there are people who depend on him making smart choices. Orm's presence reinforces this lesson because Orm represents a more disciplined form of leadership. Arthur's instinctive style and Orm's structured approach can complement each other. Their partnership demonstrates that leadership does not have to look the same in every person. Arthur brings adaptability, humor, and a connection to the surface world. Orm brings Atlantean knowledge, discipline, and experience as a ruler. Together, they become stronger because they do not have identical strengths. This is one of the reasons their action scenes work. Their cooperation is not simply two characters hitting the same enemies. Their different abilities and personalities create variety. Arthur is willing to improvise. Orm is more controlled. Arthur can adapt quickly. Orm understands the political and historical side of Atlantis. Their differences remain visible even after they become allies, which makes the relationship more believable. They do not suddenly become identical heroes. They learn to use their differences to their advantage. This is also the emotional lesson Arthur needs as king. A ruler who believes he must personally solve every problem will eventually fail. Arthur needs allies. He needs family. He needs people who can challenge him. Orm becomes one of those people. The irony is that the person who once represented the greatest threat to Arthur's rule becomes one of the people most capable of helping him protect it. This gives the sequel a satisfying sense of reversal. The first movie ended with Arthur defeating Orm. The sequel begins with Arthur realizing that Orm's strength can now be useful. This is not simply a convenient plot decision. It demonstrates that circumstances can change relationships. People who were enemies under one set of conditions can become allies under another. The challenge is whether they can overcome the emotional history that separates them. Arthur and Orm do not erase their past. They build something new on top of it. That is why their partnership is more interesting than a simple friendship. There is tension underneath it. Arthur remembers what Orm did. Orm remembers losing his throne. Their cooperation is therefore an act of trust. The movie's comedy helps make that trust easier to develop. Arthur's teasing gradually breaks down Orm's rigid personality. Orm's seriousness gives Arthur someone to play against. Their conversations become a way of demonstrating emotional change without lengthy speeches. At the beginning, Orm is resistant and irritated. As the story progresses, he becomes more comfortable with Arthur's style. Arthur, meanwhile, becomes more respectful of Orm's abilities. Their relationship shifts from rivalry toward mutual respect. That shift is the emotional spine of the adventure. Black Manta's revenge creates the external pressure that makes it possible. Without Black Manta, Arthur and Orm might never have had a reason to cooperate. The villain therefore accidentally becomes the catalyst for the brothers' reconciliation. This is another interesting contrast between characters. Black Manta wants to destroy Arthur because he cannot move beyond the past. Arthur and Orm are forced to move beyond their past because of Black Manta's actions. The same threat produces opposite responses. One creates hatred, the other creates cooperation. The movie's themes therefore reinforce one another. Revenge divides. Responsibility unites. Fear can isolate. Trust can create strength. Power can destroy when driven by obsession, but power can protect when guided by responsibility. These ideas are straightforward, but they are consistent throughout the main character relationships. The visual spectacle also supports the theme of unity. The climactic action involves characters who previously stood on opposite sides fighting together. The image of Arthur and Orm cooperating has symbolic value because it demonstrates that the kingdom's future cannot be built on the divisions of the past. Arthur's mixed heritage already makes him a symbol of connection. His relationship with Orm extends that idea to family. His relationship with the surface extends it to politics. His environmental concerns extend it to the planet. The character therefore becomes a bridge in several different ways. This is the logical evolution of the Aquaman identity. He is powerful because he belongs to multiple worlds. The first movie established that he was worthy of the throne because he could unite Atlantis. The sequel expands that role by showing that he can also unite people who have reasons to distrust one another. That makes his leadership more meaningful than simply being the strongest person in the room. A king who can inspire cooperation is more valuable than a king who can win every fight. The film does not always explore this idea with great depth, but it repeatedly returns to it through Arthur's relationships. His family trusts him. His people depend on him. Orm learns to work with him. Mera stands beside him. His parents remain part of his support system. The kingdom becomes less a backdrop and more a network of relationships. This helps humanize Atlantis. In the first movie, Atlantis was primarily a political objective. In the sequel, it is Arthur's home and responsibility. That difference matters. He is no longer trying to earn the throne. He is trying to protect the people who live under it. This makes the stakes more personal. The movie also gives Arthur a chance to demonstrate that being king is not simply about ruling from a palace. He has to enter dangerous situations himself. He cannot expect others to face threats he is unwilling to face. This creates another aspect of leadership. Example. Arthur's willingness to risk himself encourages others to follow. His physical power makes him capable of doing this, but his willingness to sacrifice gives that power meaning. The movie's action sequences repeatedly place him in situations where he could choose safety but instead chooses responsibility. This reinforces his development from adventurer to leader. The humor sometimes complicates that development because Arthur still behaves like someone who enjoys danger. Yet this is also part of the character's charm. He does not become a completely serious king. He remains Arthur Curry. The challenge is learning when the jokes can continue and when responsibility must take priority. The movie's tone reflects that balance. It shifts between comedy, family drama, fantasy adventure, environmental messaging, and large-scale action. Such tonal variety can be difficult to manage. Some scenes transition smoothly because the Arthur-Orm relationship provides a consistent emotional tone. Other transitions can feel abrupt because the movie moves quickly from serious danger to comedy. Still, this tonal unpredictability is part of the franchise's identity. Aquaman has always been a character who can be both ridiculous and heroic. The sequel embraces that contradiction. It does not want to be a dark, realistic superhero film. It wants to be a colorful adventure that takes its characters seriously while allowing the audience to laugh at the absurdity of their world. This is particularly visible in the treatment of Orm. His transformation from villain to reluctant ally allows the film to make comedy out of his discomfort. The character who once demanded obedience now has to follow Arthur's unconventional methods. That reversal is inherently funny. It also demonstrates that power can change perspective. Orm once believed his royal status made him superior. Now he has to learn from someone he once considered beneath him. Arthur's humility is not perfect, but his ability to treat Orm casually eventually helps break down the hierarchy between them. They become brothers before they become political allies. That emotional shift is important because the movie's strongest theme is ultimately family. The kingdom, the ocean, and the world matter, but Arthur's personal motivation remains rooted in the people he loves. His father, mother, wife, child, and brother all contribute to his understanding of what responsibility means. The movie therefore expands the definition of family beyond biology. Atlantis itself becomes a kind of family that Arthur is responsible for. His role as king means he must care about people he does not personally know. This is the challenge of leadership, caring about strangers because their well-being is connected to your responsibility. Arthur's personal growth is therefore measured by the expansion of his sense of responsibility. He begins as a man who primarily thinks about his own choices. He becomes a ruler who has to think about the consequences for everyone. That growth gives the sequel its emotional purpose. The movie's large-scale action then becomes a demonstration of that responsibility. When Arthur enters battle, he is not fighting because he wants glory. He is fighting because people need him. That distinction separates him from Black Manta. Black Manta fights because he wants revenge. Arthur fights because he wants protection. Their motivations may produce similar physical violence, but the moral direction is completely different. Black Manta's goal becomes increasingly destructive because revenge has no natural endpoint. Once he hurts Arthur, he still needs more. Once he threatens his family, he still needs more. Once he threatens Atlantis, the consequences expand further. Revenge constantly demands another target. Responsibility.
एक्वामैन अच्छा है, आके देखो सीने नज़रिया में, बहुत अच्छा मूवी है। तुमको देखना के लिए सीने नज़रिया में आ जाओ। एक्वामैन 2023 का मूवी है, एकदम पॉपुलर मूवी है, आगे ज़रूर देखना।
By contrast, creates a reason to stop. Arthur wants to protect specific people in a specific world. His goal has boundaries. This makes his violence defensive rather than endlessly escalating. The Black Trident amplifies the destructive nature of Black Manta's obsession because it gives him the power to pursue revenge on a much larger scale. The ancient weapon is therefore both a plot device and a symbol. It represents what happens when old hatred is given new power. The Lost Kingdom represents buried history, while Black Manta represents someone who refuses to leave the past behind. Arthur and Orm represent the possibility of changing the future. The story therefore places past and future in opposition. Black Manta looks backward, Arthur looks forward. Orm is forced to move from his old identity toward a new one. The conflict is not only about who wins a battle, it is about which philosophy survives. Will the characters remain trapped by what happened before, or will they build something different? The answer is expressed through Arthur and Orm's alliance. Their cooperation demonstrates that history does not have to dictate the future. The brothers once fought over the throne. Now they fight together to protect the kingdom. That transformation is simple but satisfying because it gives the sequel a sense of emotional progression. The first movie established the conflict. The second movie shows what happens after the conflict when the characters are forced to live with the consequences. Arthur has the throne. Orm has lost it. Black Manta has lost his father and refuses to let go. These different consequences create the emotional landscape of the sequel. The characters are not starting from zero. They are carrying history into the new story. This continuity is important for a sequel. The movie does not simply introduce new characters and ignore the previous film. It uses the previous relationships as the foundation for the new conflict. That makes the sequel feel connected even when the plot becomes larger and more fantastical. The return of characters such as Mera, Atlana, Nerus, Stephen Shin, and Thomas Curry also reinforces continuity. DC's official cast listing confirms the returning ensemble alongside Momoa, Wilson, Hurd, Abdul-Mateen II, and Kidman. However, the screenplay naturally gives Arthur, Orm, and Black Manta the greatest attention because their conflict drives the central plot. Mera remains important as Arthur's partner and the mother of his child, but her role is not as deeply developed as the brothers' relationship. This is one of the areas where the movie could have offered more. Mera is an established warrior and queen, yet much of the emotional narrative is organized around Arthur and Orm. Her importance is clear, but the screenplay does not always give her enough room to develop independently. The same is true for several supporting characters. Their presence enriches the world, but their individual arcs are limited by the number of plot threads the film is trying to manage. This is a common problem in large ensemble superhero movies. Every character brings history, abilities, and expectations, but the runtime cannot provide equal depth to everyone. The movie chooses to prioritize the brothers, and that decision is understandable because their relationship is the most distinctive element of the story. Still, it means some supporting characters feel more functional than fully developed. The production itself reflects the scale of the story. The numbers lists a production budget of $205 million and a worldwide box office of $440,181,226, with $124,481,226 from the domestic market and $315,700,000 from international markets. Those numbers demonstrate how large the movie was as a commercial production. A budget of more than $200 million creates expectations for enormous visuals, and the film certainly attempts to deliver them. The underwater environments, creatures, costumes, vehicles, battles, and digital effects require a huge amount of technical work. The result is visually ambitious even when individual effects are inconsistent. The worldwide gross also demonstrates that the movie maintained significant international appeal despite performing far below the first Aquaman. The original film had become a major global success, and the sequel's lower total inevitably affected perceptions of its commercial impact. However, the sequel still reached more than $440 million worldwide, placing it among the higher-grossing films of 2023. 6. The financial performance should therefore be understood in context. It was not the extraordinary phenomenon that the first Aquaman became, but it was still a large theatrical release with significant global reach. The production budget also means that gross revenue should not be treated as direct profit. A movie's theatrical gross is divided between theaters and the studio, while marketing and distribution costs are separate from the production budget. Therefore, the numbers show commercial performance rather than a simple profit calculation. The release date was December 22, 2023 in North America according to DC's official movie page, with the film opening internationally around the same period. 7. The holiday season release fits the movie's adventure identity. Large fantasy films often benefit from holiday audiences because families and general audiences have more opportunities to visit theaters. Aquaman's colorful world also makes it a natural choice for viewers looking for spectacle during the holiday period. The release timing also placed it at the end of the DCEU era, giving it an unusual historical position. It was not simply another sequel. It was the final theatrical film associated with the DCEU's long-running movie continuity. That context does not dominate the story, but it changes how audiences interpret the movie. There is a sense that the film is closing a chapter. The movie does not attempt to bring every DCEU character together for a farewell. Instead, it concludes the Aquaman storyline by focusing on Arthur's family, kingdom, and future. That decision is arguably better for the film because a giant crossover would have distracted from the story. The movie's final chapter therefore feels more like the end of Arthur Curry's DCEU journey than the end of every character's story. The fact that Aquaman's personal arc reaches a more stable point gives the movie a natural sense of closure. Arthur is no longer searching for his identity. He has accepted his role. He has a family. He has an ally in Orm. He understands his responsibilities. He has learned that being king is not about standing above everyone else but about protecting the people who depend on him. That is a satisfying evolution from the first movie. The first film's question was whether Arthur could become king. The sequel's question is whether he can become the kind of king who deserves the responsibility. His answer is demonstrated through action rather than speeches. He chooses to work with Orm. He protects his family. He defends Atlantis. He attempts to maintain a relationship with the surface world. He confronts Black Manta. He refuses to allow revenge to determine his identity. These choices complete the character's journey. Orm's journey is equally important because his story moves in the opposite direction. He begins from a position of power and loses it. Instead of allowing that loss to destroy him, he eventually discovers a new purpose. His redemption is not based on reclaiming the throne immediately. It is based on proving that he can serve something larger than his own ambition. This gives his character a more hopeful conclusion. He does not need to become king again to have value. His worth comes from what he chooses to do. That is an important contrast with his earlier identity. The first movie's Orm believed power gave him legitimacy. The sequel's Orm learns that loyalty and responsibility can give him purpose even without a crown. Arthur, meanwhile, learns that a crown is not the source of his identity. The brothers therefore meet in the middle. One has gained the throne but must learn humility. The other has lost the throne but must learn purpose. Their partnership becomes the result of those two lessons. This is the emotional architecture that makes the sequel more interesting than its simple plot might suggest. Black Manta's story functions as a warning about refusing to learn those lessons. He does not adapt. He does not forgive. He does not accept loss. He continues moving in the same direction until his personal revenge becomes a threat to everyone. The Black Trident gives him more power but does not give him greater wisdom. This is why his villainy becomes tragic as well as threatening. His original grief is understandable, but his inability to process it transforms him. The movie therefore presents three different responses to loss. Arthur responds by accepting responsibility. Orm responds by adapting. Black Manta responds by seeking revenge. Those three responses shape the entire narrative. The external plot is a battle over Atlantis and the ancient weapon, but the internal story is about what people do after they have lost something. Arthur has lost his freedom. Orm has lost his throne. Black Manta has lost his father. Each character must decide what comes next. The movie's answer is clear. Moving forward requires accepting change. Arthur cannot return to the carefree life he once had. Orm cannot simply return to being the king he was. Black Manta refuses to accept either reality and therefore becomes increasingly destructive. This gives the film a surprisingly coherent emotional theme beneath its enormous action. The Lost Kingdom itself reinforces the idea of history. It is a civilization that has disappeared, leaving behind a dangerous legacy. The present characters are forced to deal with the consequences of something ancient. This suggests that the past cannot always be erased, but it can be understood and handled responsibly. Arthur's leadership depends on understanding history without becoming trapped by it. Orm's redemption depends on acknowledging his past without repeating it. Black Manta's failure comes from allowing his past to control his future. This thematic pattern makes the ancient mythology relevant to the characters rather than merely decorative. The Black Trident is dangerous because it carries the power of the past into the present. The heroes succeed because they refuse to let that power determine their choices. This is the deeper meaning behind the Lost Kingdom. It is not simply a place for the heroes to explore. It is a representation of forgotten consequences. What was buried eventually returns, and the characters must decide how to respond. The movie's fantasy-adventure structure therefore supports its character themes. The journey into the Lost Kingdom is a literal journey into the past. Arthur and Orm travel into a forgotten world while simultaneously confronting their own history. The external journey mirrors the internal one. They enter a dangerous environment together, discover ancient secrets, face Black Manta's growing power, and emerge with a changed understanding of their relationship. This parallel gives the adventure a stronger sense of purpose. The locations are not simply backgrounds. They represent different stages of the story. Atlantis represents Arthur's present responsibility. The Lost Kingdom represents the buried past. The surface world represents the broader future that Arthur wants to connect with Atlantis. The family represents the personal future Arthur wants to protect. Black Manta represents the destructive past that refuses to disappear. These elements form a symbolic map of the character's journey. Arthur stands between them. As king, he must protect the present. As a father, he must protect the future. As the son of two worlds, he must reconcile different identities. As the brother of Orm, he must deal with the past. This makes Aquaman more than a character who happens to live underwater. His entire identity is built around connection. The sequel uses that connection as the foundation for its story. Arthur's greatest strength is not simply physical power. It is his ability to bring different worlds together. He can understand the surface because of his human father. He can rule Atlantis because of his Atlantean heritage. He can understand Orm because they share a mother. He can understand the ocean because of his unique abilities. This makes him uniquely suited to be the bridge between worlds. The movie's environmental message is therefore not separate from his character. Protecting the ocean is protecting the part of himself that connects both worlds. Protecting Atlantis is protecting his heritage. Protecting his family is protecting his future. Protecting the surface is protecting the other half of his identity. All of these responsibilities intersect. That is why the sequel feels like a natural continuation even when the story becomes much larger. Arthur's world has expanded because his responsibilities have expanded. The visual scale is therefore an external representation of the character's growth. The first movie introduced him to a hidden world. The second requires him to manage that world. He is no longer exploring Atlantis as an outsider. He is responsible for what happens there. This shift changes how the audience should interpret his actions. A reckless decision that might have been charming in the first movie can become irresponsible in the sequel. The movie acknowledges this tension by surrounding Arthur with people who can challenge him. Orm provides discipline. Mera provides partnership. His parents provide perspective. His kingdom provides responsibility. Together, they force Arthur to recognize that he cannot remain exactly the same person he was before. He can keep his humor and personality, but he has to develop judgment. That is the difference between growing older and growing up. The movie's emotional success therefore depends heavily on the audience accepting that Arthur is still himself while becoming more responsible. Jason Momoa's performance maintains the character's recognizable charm, which prevents the sequel from becoming overly serious. The movie can therefore present Arthur's growth without making him unrecognizable. This is important because superhero sequels sometimes overcorrect by making their heroes dramatically darker or more serious. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom does not make that mistake. It allows Arthur to remain fun. The humor is part of his identity, and the story uses it to keep the adventure accessible. The challenge is that the humor occasionally undermines dramatic scenes. A serious moment can lose impact if a joke arrives too quickly. But when the humor is rooted in character, particularly in Arthur and Orm's relationship, it strengthens the film. The comedy works because it reveals personality. Arthur teases Orm because he feels comfortable with him. Orm's irritation shows that their relationship is becoming more familiar. The jokes therefore become evidence of emotional progress. At the beginning, Orm might not tolerate Arthur's behavior. Later, he understands it. That change is subtle but meaningful. The movie's action also benefits from this relationship because the brothers' personalities remain visible even during combat. They do not become interchangeable superheroes. Arthur fights with instinct and confidence. Orm fights with discipline and precision. Their teamwork therefore reflects their character differences. The audience can recognize who is doing what even within large action sequences. This helps preserve personality inside spectacle. The film's most effective action scenes are those where character relationships affect the choreography. When Arthur and Orm fight together, the audience is watching their relationship change physically. They have to trust each other. They have to coordinate. They have to protect one another. Every successful combination demonstrates growing trust. This is more satisfying than simply watching two powerful characters defeat enemies. The action becomes a form of communication. They learn how to fight together because they are learning how to understand one another. That is one of the best examples of the movie connecting spectacle to character. The same principle applies to Black Manta. His fighting style is driven by aggression and revenge. He is not fighting simply to win. He is fighting to hurt Arthur. That emotional motivation makes his attacks more personal. His power is frightening because it is directed by obsession. He is willing to take risks that a rational person would avoid because he values revenge more than survival. This makes him unpredictable. Arthur can anticipate a normal enemy's desire to survive. Black Manta may be willing to sacrifice himself if it means hurting Arthur. That makes him dangerous. His refusal to let go of his grief gives him a kind of destructive determination. The movie uses that determination to escalate the threat. The Black Trident gives physical form to his obsession. The weapon is not simply a powerful object. It is a representation of the past returning with destructive force. Arthur and Orm therefore need to defeat both the weapon and the mindset behind it. They cannot simply overpower Black Manta physically. They need to prevent his revenge from destroying everything around him. The final conflict therefore becomes a battle between different ways of responding to loss. Arthur's family gives him a reason to protect. Orm's loss of the throne gives him a reason to change. Black Manta's loss gives him a reason to destroy. The movie's moral position is clear. Pain is unavoidable, but what people do with pain is a choice. That is the deeper lesson beneath the superhero action. Arthur's growth is not measured by how powerful he becomes. He was already powerful. It is measured by how responsibly he uses that power. Orm's growth is not measured by whether he gets the throne back. It is measured by whether he can find value without it. Black Manta's tragedy is that he allows revenge to become his entire identity. This makes the movie's character arcs surprisingly symmetrical. Each major character is defined by a different relationship with power and loss. Arthur has power and must learn responsibility. Orm loses power and must learn purpose. Black Manta gains power and loses control. The Lost Kingdom provides the setting in which these arcs collide. The ancient weapon gives Black Manta power. The brothers enter the Lost Kingdom to understand and stop that power. Their journey forces them to cooperate. The kingdom's history reveals the consequences of uncontrolled power. Everything connects back to the central theme. The film's biggest weakness is not that it lacks ideas. It is that it sometimes has too many ideas and too little time to explore them deeply. The environmental theme, family theme, redemption theme, political theme, ancient mythology, revenge story, superhero action, and comedy all compete for attention. The result is entertaining but occasionally shallow. Some ideas are introduced and resolved quickly. Some supporting characters appear without receiving enough emotional development. Some dialogue explains themes that could have been shown through action. The film therefore works better as a fast-paced adventure than as a deeply layered character drama. That is not necessarily a failure. Different movies have different goals. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom clearly prioritizes entertainment and spectacle. It wants the audience to enjoy the journey. It wants to show the underwater world at enormous scale. It wants Arthur and Orm to become an entertaining duo. It wants Black Manta to feel dangerous. It wants the final battle to be visually large. Within those goals, the movie often succeeds. Its shortcomings become more noticeable when judged against expectations created by its enormous budget. A $205 million production naturally invites comparisons with the biggest blockbuster films. The numbers confirms that the production budget was approximately $205 million, while the worldwide gross reached approximately $440.18 million. That level of investment means every visual weakness becomes more noticeable. The audience expects extraordinary consistency because the movie has extraordinary resources. Still, the imagination behind the world is difficult to deny. The film has a distinctive visual identity. It is not afraid to make Atlantis colorful, strange, and excessive. It treats underwater fantasy as a legitimate blockbuster setting. That commitment is valuable because the Aquaman franchise would lose much of its personality if it tried to imitate more grounded superhero films. The character works precisely because his world is unusual. Talking to fish, riding sea creatures, exploring lost kingdoms, and fighting ancient oceanic forces may sound absurd outside the context of the story, but within this universe they create a coherent fantasy language. The sequel embraces that language completely. It is therefore best approached not as realistic science fiction but as comic book mythology with superhero characters. Once the audience accepts that tone, many of the movie's strange elements become part of the fun. The visual effects can then be judged primarily by whether they support the fantasy rather than whether they resemble real underwater environments. Some effects are convincing, others less so, but the overall imagination remains strong. James Wan's direction gives the movie a sense of movement and adventure. His ability to stage large action sequences is clear, and his background in horror helps him create darker moments around the ancient threat. The Lost Kingdom has a different atmosphere from Atlantis. It feels more dangerous and mysterious. That contrast helps keep the movie visually varied. The director understands that a fantasy adventure needs different emotional environments. Colorful Atlantis can feel vibrant and energetic. The Lost Kingdom can feel oppressive and dangerous. The surface world can feel more familiar. The contrast between those locations gives the journey structure. It also reinforces Arthur's position between worlds. He moves between the surface and the ocean, between family and kingdom, between humor and responsibility, and between his past and future. The film's visual movement mirrors those transitions. Arthur is constantly traveling because his identity is constantly being tested. This makes the adventure feel appropriate for his character. The movie's use of creatures is another important part of its appeal. Aquaman's world is populated by marine life that can be transformed into fantasy creatures without losing its connection to the ocean. Giant creatures become part of battles, transportation, and world building. These elements make the movie feel more like a fantasy epic than a conventional superhero story. The first Aquaman established that identity, and the sequel expands it. The ocean becomes a playground for imagination. The filmmakers can invent species, vehicles, environments, and civilizations that would be impossible in a grounded setting. This freedom is one of the franchise's greatest creative advantages. The problem is that digital fantasy requires strong visual coherence. If everything is digital, the audience needs consistent lighting, texture, movement, and scale. When those elements align, the world feels believable. When they do not, the audience notices the effects. This explains why the film's visual reception has been mixed. The imagination is strong, but execution varies from sequence to sequence. Still, the movie's visual ambition is part of what makes it recognizable. It would be unfair to evaluate it as though it were trying to be a realistic drama. It is trying to deliver a giant comic book fantasy. The spectacle is the point. The important question is whether the spectacle is connected to the characters. The best moments say yes. Arthur and Orm's journey through the Lost Kingdom is entertaining because their relationship is changing. Black Manta's attacks are threatening because they target Arthur's family. Atlantis's danger matters because Arthur is responsible for it. The environmental crisis matters because Arthur's identity connects the ocean and surface world. These connections prevent the movie from becoming entirely hollow. Even when the plot becomes complicated, the emotional motivations remain simple. Arthur wants to protect. Orm wants to find purpose. Black Manta wants revenge. That simplicity helps the audience navigate the spectacle. The movie does not require the viewer to remember every political detail if the viewer understands those three motivations. This is an effective storytelling choice for a blockbuster. The audience can follow the emotional logic even when the mythology becomes elaborate. The film's final emotional message is therefore straightforward. Family relationships can change. Enemies can become allies. People can grow beyond their past. Power should be used responsibly. Revenge can consume the person who seeks it. Leadership is about responsibility rather than status. The ocean